Indonesia is overwhelmed in the aftermath of an earthquake and tsunami, while regions from the U.S. to India and Asia struggle to rebuild after powerful storms. So why is the response often very different in poor and rich countries? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. In the wake of a disaster, certain needs are obvious: food, medicine, clean water, and the restoration of power. But as the last few weeks have shown, getting all those things to devastated communities is far more difficult when disaster strikes in poor or remote areas. Our topic today is disaster relief, its unique challenges, and how they vary from place to place and disaster to disaster. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Wayne Hay, who's in Palu, one of the worst hit areas by this week's earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia.
There is an exodus taking place from central Sulawesi. Thousands are leaving their quake and tsunami-ravaged communities, boarding military planes from Palu, all with traumatic memories.
It was so crazy. I was unconscious for a long time because the ceiling fell on me.
The airport was severely damaged in the quake and inoperable for a time. But the military has taken over, allowing the Indonesian Air Force to come and go. Aboard one plane was the president, who made his second visit to the disaster areas. This time his first stop was just outside the cracked terminal building, where a hospital ward has been set up, where the sick and injured wait to be airlifted.
Just tell us what the priority is at the moment in terms of the recovery effort.
Yeah, of course, the first step is evacuating. After that, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Yeah.
Among the patients, Haji Luliana, who gave birth 3 days before the quake. She and her family lost their home and walked for 4 days to get help. Now they have no choice but to leave.
Everybody was running from their houses when the quake happened. My home is completely destroyed and we had to sleep on the street.
For now, the remains of the airport offer some comfort that one chapter of their ordeal is drawing to a close. For those who choose to stay, help is gradually arriving, at least to the airport.
As well as getting people out of here, the military planes have been bringing aid in. But getting it from the airport to the communities, the people that need it most, seems to be a slow process.
Much sits at the airport awaiting distribution. But for an increasing number of people, the wait for a place on a flight to safety is over. As they leave, they perhaps contemplate an even longer wait before they'll be able to return home.
Indonesia is far from the only place dealing with great tragedy this year. We've seen powerful storms in several parts of the world. Super Typhoon Mangkhut hit northern Philippines last month, tearing off roofs, uprooting trees, and triggering landslides that caused flooding. Also last month, Hurricane Florence flooded homes and streets in the U.S. states of North and South Carolina. Over 500,000 people lost power. In August, the southern Indian state of Kerala was hit by its worst floods in nearly a century. Hundreds of people were killed and at least 1 million displaced. And last year, Puerto Rico and Dominica suffered their worst natural disaster in decades when Hurricane Maria made landfall, causing extensive damage. All right, let's bring in our guests. Ruben Romero, an operational support specialist for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. He joined us on Skype from Geneva. And from Jakarta, Paolo Lubrano, he's the head of Asia Humanitarian Aid for OXFAM, and also joins us on Skype. Paolo, I want to start with you. Can you speak specifically about how the response is going with regards to the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia?
Yes, at the moment the response is still quite slow. The logistics to reach the most affected place is difficult. The timing that it requires to deliver immediate aid, it's growing. And it's also growing the number of people in need. Just as a couple of hours ago, the number of victims is raising to well over 1,500. And the number of people potentially impacted is over 2 million. And in front of that magnitude of needs, necessarily the response is still a bit slow.
I mean, Ruben, Paolo there touched on something very important when he spoke about the logistical difficulties. Can you try to elucidate to our audience, I mean, how difficult is that? Every situation varies, but when it comes to the logistics, how challenging can that be for an aid organization to overcome?
I can see, well, good afternoon first. I can see two aspects, main importantly, in a situation like the one that we are facing now in Indonesia and Sulawesi, but also it happened in Lombok, which is the accessibility and how difficult, especially now, for instance, in Sulawesi, we have the airport cut or very limited capacity to arrive to successfully receive non-food items, to successfully receive humanitarian goods. We also see as a challenge the logistic preparedness. Preparedness that in case of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, with the PMI, with the National Society in Indonesia, is well in place. We have a stock preposition, but we are talking about a very remote area. So basically, shipping the goods and arriving them to ports that are not in condition due to the disaster is definitely a key challenge. So I agree with my colleague, logistics is now tremendously complicated in a scenario like Indonesia, or like it happens also recently in the Philippines.
Paolo, let's talk for a minute about different scenarios when it comes to, response to disasters. What are the most basic differences, the most fundamental differences when a major disaster strikes a rich populated area as opposed to a poor remote area?
Well, first of all, the speed. In richer country, it's much easier to mobilize resources, to mobilize staff. Logistic arrangement in general are much faster, much more efficient. It doesn't happen in poor countries. And we're talking in this particular case of somewhere in between, not necessarily extremely poor country, middle-income country, and that's the case of several countries in Asia. I think also the other difference is the time of recovery. In places like Indonesia, where disasters are recurrent, where people are impacted by typhoons year over year over year, or in the Philippines, where typhoons are quite common and the crops have been almost entirely damaged, the time of recovery in a poor country is much longer. In a richer country, it can take less time. There's more resources available, and the investment done from the states is much higher.
Ruben, what are specific things or specific steps that relief agencies can take or plan to take going forward to better plan for contingencies?
Yes, well, in every country, there is a national emergency response system. Part of it, naturally, as part of the auxiliary role to the authorities, but also international NGOs, UN agencies. Contingency plan based on a specific scenario is something that gets done on regular basis. Is the minimum preparedness measure that we can put in place to set a scenario and identify not only the capacity that we have, but also the gaps, and fix those gaps. I'm talking about complicated measures that can be about resourcing your preposition stock to be ready for a disaster, but I'm also talking about very simple measures. And here I'm talking about having simulation exercises at community level. So starting with evacuations, identifying safe areas, early warning systems in place, sometimes highly complicated or technological, sometimes as simple as to enable communities to communicate, to warn each other when a risk is happening. We have in the Red Cross on regular basis these contingency plans, but that is something that cannot be done in isolation. That definitely is not a plan that goes for one specific organization. It has to be integrated with the rest of the humanitarian stakeholders and system. So that's why, especially with the authorities, but also with the UN, INGOs, and the Red Cross, we regularly practice and put in place contingency plans.
Okay, Paolo, you heard Ruben there speaking, about dealing with the authorities, and that really leads me to my next question, because when you're talking about getting to these affected areas, you have to deal with the government, you have to deal with security officials, the military. How difficult is that, and what can governments better do going forward to try to help aid agencies, get relief to those worst affected?
Well, it's very important that the humanitarian space is maintained. So the access to local impacted community for international humanitarian agency is protected and is supported. Government can facilitate it through a provision of visas, through provision of logistic arrangement if it's in case. NGOs are open and of course support the local government in that response. We don't have to forget that the local government is the first responder well before international agencies. And I think it's also important that the local government nurture and supports local organizations. OXFAM over the years has been working very closely with a number of local agencies, local community-based organizations. And those, again, are the first responders. I think that's a double role that the government has, certainly supporting international agencies, but also opening the space and supporting the space for local humanitarian agencies.
Ruben, I saw you nodding along to some of what Paolo was saying, so I want to get your reaction to what he was saying, but also I want to bring up the point about, it's not just about getting the cooperation, there's also a lot of, bureaucracy when it comes to this, figuring out who exactly is in charge, who is giving orders, who is implementing things. Can you talk specifically about those difficulties, those challenges?
Absolutely. If I may start them, I was nodding because I fully agree with the challenges that Paolo was mentioning, from creating humanitarian space, but also to the work that needs to be done. And I think is prioritized not only by the governments, but also by humanitarian stakeholders and organizations on disaster risk reduction at community level. I definitely agree. The first responder in an emergency situation is your neighbor, is your relative. That's the first nurse you're going to get. So investing at community level in equipping and preparing and training communities to be able to first respond is something that really saves lives. The Red Cross is present from national, global, but also local level. So that's something that takes part of our day-to-day preparedness for effective response on the communities and on our Red Cross and Red Crescent branches. When it comes to the challenges, you mentioned challenges about authorities.
About authorities and about bureaucracy in particular.
Well, if we want to avoid challenges, some we cannot, and I'm talking about specifically accessibility aspects. We're talking about physical challenges when it comes to remote areas that gets transportation systems disrupted, that gets airports, harbors unoperational. That there is little we can do other than actually better preparedness. But I think contingency planning is still the key. Is planning ahead. Contingency planning is the basics of if an event happens, how are you going to do to respond to the key needs that may arise? And we do that quite often. It's true that in more developed or less developed scenarios, we are still going to face challenges. Challenges which you mentioned before about the Philippines with the Manmade, but we can also mention even in very well-developed systems. You mentioned the U.S. and we face. I remember as a Red Cross in 2005 with Katrina, we face serious difficulties there. I'd say bureaucracy or any delays on response need to be tackled by appropriate preparedness, and contingency planning for us is the key.
Ruben, let me follow up with you on that, because you brought up the U.S. and something that I've witnessed from people around the world is when they've seen the response to whether it be Katrina or Hurricane Maria last year. I mean, they were really shocked to see the U.S., a country that powerful and that rich, fumble that response in that way. I mean, how do you make sense of that? How can you explain that a country like the U.S., can so poorly respond to a crisis of that magnitude?
We were mentioning before, and I think that was your first question about the difference in not disasters, but let's say in major events that can happen in more developed or less developed countries. Here, the critical aspect is the level of preparation which in the case of, in the case of the US, for instance, and getting in quite the close contact with colleagues from the American Red Cross, they're very well prepared. But we are facing more and more stronger events. So basically, the effects and the devastation goes beyond what we normally get prepared for. Let's remember the tsunami also in 2011 in Japan that went absolutely out of the scope that we could think of in a country that is very well prepared for these sort of events, for major earthquakes.
Paolo, let me ask you this. If we're talking about, growing concern, we're living at a time when more and more people are raising the alarm about climate change and about the effects of climate change. And at a time when there seem to be more storms and the storms are more powerful, how much concern does that bring to you and your colleagues? I mean, are you worried about what's going to happen in the years to come, specifically because of the effects of climate change?
Absolutely. And I think one of the impacts, besides the increased magnitude and impact of natural disasters, is also the longer-term impact. OXFAM has been very vocal and has been flagging this problem for a long time. The impact on agriculture, the impact on water and water resources. And it's also important to understand that while some of those disasters are immediately visible, and they grab media attention and they grab attention of donors, there are some others that are growing slowly and they're equally concerning. If you look at what happens now between Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, there's a growing crisis, it's a drought. Water resources are limited. They will be even more limited in the future. The impact on agriculture, on livestock, on food security is very high. OXFAM is engaged in responding also to those forgotten crises to some extent, if you will. And that's where you see really the impact of climate change. I think it's not only the immediate, visible, striking impact of this crisis we're observing in these days, but it's also the longer-term impact that it has on the life of people.
Ruben, Paolo just raised a point. It was something I actually wanted to ask you about. He spoke about grabbing the attention of donors. One thing that I've come across when I've spoken to aid workers covering, different natural disasters and crises is I encounter a lot of relief workers who have been telling me the last few years that they worry about what they call empathy fatigue, meaning that we're living in a time where there are so many crises and disasters that are reported upon that sometimes people just feel bombarded by this constant stream of bad news and perhaps aren't donating as much. Is that something that's a concern to you? Do you feel that more and more people in the world are sort of turning their attention away from the kinds of relief efforts where you really need people to contribute to?
We have definitely more and more disasters because also the possibilities of communication gets way more smooth and rapid. We get on real-time disasters that some of them, as mentioned by Paolo, are protracted crisis, food security related. We have ongoing sudden onset and slow onset disasters in Africa, in the Americas. We get failures of dams in Laos, displacing thousands of people, or in Myanmar. And that is overwhelming. But for humanitarian organizations, this is our aim to respond to those needs, and there is no hesitation when it comes to trigger the button of responding immediately there. Some organizations with more resources or with more presence in the communities, some organizations bringing from regional areas, some regional resources or global resources, but definitely the fatigue, if you may say, of constant and more recurrent disaster might not and cannot impede international support to the governments, to the authorities that are actually in responsibility of responding to those events.
Paolo, what do you say to that? I mean, is it getting harder for you and your colleagues to get the attention, as you say, of the donors? I mean, I know we need to break it down between the international community, meaning the governments or the UN, and between, just ordinary citizens. But do you feel that it's getting harder to get people's attention, to get them to donate money to causes like this?
It is indeed, especially for if you will, smaller scale crisis. My colleague was mentioning the recent flooding in Myanmar and in Laos, relatively smaller crises with significant impact on the population that are often forgotten or just put on the side by bigger crises. I think all of that imposes new ways of working and new ways of using the resources that we have. As I was mentioning before, OXFAM works a lot with local organizations, local communities, being grounded in the local realities and having connection with the different groups and well-established relationships also with the government does help, might generate a new way of working, which is what in some humanitarian language we call local humanitarian leadership, a very radical new approach to responding emergencies through local partners, through local communities. And that's where the lack of attention, if you will, in some cases of donors will bring humanitarian agencies to do more and more.
Ruben, we've been talking a lot, of course, about natural disasters, but what about man-made problems? I mean, how much are they an issue? I'm talking about things like Fukushima disaster, disease outbreaks such as Ebola. How much of an impact does that have these days on the work that you're doing?
Well, definitely a major impact. We're talking about population movement, which was you have it across different regions. We had it, and we still have it in Europe, which is an enormous crisis. That's not a man-made disaster. But let me highlight it because I think it's also important. We had it in Bangladesh. We have it in South America. We have it in a number of countries in Africa. You have man-made disasters. I mentioned recently the dam collapse in Laos or floods in Myanmar, but also in Colombia, for instance. And it's happening, or I remember also in Ukraine and in Belarus, where we have industrial spills out that, as my colleague was saying, it might not be perceived as a major issue, but definitely for local population, it is a major issue. And for organizations that attend and address needs of the people, that for us still remains a priority. It's not the size of the damage of the event, is our capacity to address those needs.
Paolo, you know, many people don't really understand the intricacies, how difficult it can be to negotiate with a particular government to gain access to a particular country, whether there's a disaster or not. I mean, we're living in a time when many countries kick out UN workers, you know. So I want to ask you about, in this day and age, is it getting more difficult for groups like yours to go into countries and help, or is it getting less difficult to get the permissions to go and try to do the work that you need to do?
It depends on the countries, but in general, it's becoming more complicated. But I think that triggers an observation that international agencies should be complementary to the local government in performing emergency response. So there are limits imposed by security, imposed by regulation, and those are sometimes restricting the space we have. But that means that we just have to be more complementary and support the government in what they do rather than replacing them, because humanitarian aid performed by humanitarian agency is not a replacement of what is the main responsibility of a country, which is responding and supporting their local population. Yes, the space is becoming more restricted, the bureaucracy is increasing, and it becomes difficult for agencies sometimes to set up quick responses, scaling up immediately because there are bureaucratic limits. But that means, again, there's a new way of working, and it's understanding that we are part of a response, not necessarily the only responder. That applies to OXFAM, it applies to all agencies.
All right, gentlemen, we are out of time, so we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much. Thanks to our guests, Ruben Romero and Paolo Lubrano. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.